There are places with a dark history, stories wrapped in mist where every sound vanishes and each shadow seems to have a life of its own. One such place is an abandoned camp in the middle of an ancient forest where time loses its meaning and the trees seem to conceal ancient secrets. This camp, once full of children and laughter, has turned into a terrifying and unpredictable place that no one dares to remember anymore. John, a young documentarian with a passion for mysteries and unexplained phenomena, came across a mention of this camp while reading articles about abandoned places. He was fascinated by the story of the camp, which was suddenly closed after a series of disappearances and strange events. While locals claimed the place was cursed, John was drawn to this dark aspect. He decided to visit the camp, make a documentary about it, and find out what really happened there. The path to the camp was challenging. With each step deeper into the forest, John felt as if he were entering another world. The air was heavy. Sunlight couldn't pierce the thick canopy, and only the occasional crackle of branches beneath his feet broke the deep silence. Eventually, an abandoned entry arch appeared before him, once welcoming guests to the camp. Now, a rusty welcome sign hung from it, and remnants of the fence were covered in moss and lichen. As he entered the camp, his steps halted. The air seemed to thicken, and the feeling of being watched became suddenly uncomfortably real. Around him stood abandoned cabins, their doors hanging askew, as if someone or something had forced them open. John felt a wave of unease, but he overcame it and headed toward the main building, where, according to rumors, all the guests once hastily left everything behind. When John entered the abandoned room, he felt a peculiar chill creeping down his spine. Old wooden tables and chairs were scattered around as if in wild panic. His eyes, however, were drawn to an object on the shelf. It was a tape recorder, covered in a layer of dust, left behind as a silent witness to the past. He turned it on, tense with anticipation of what he might hear. The old device crackled and creaked, followed by the deep voice of an older man.
"The camp watchman, third night, and I can't sleep anymore,"
the voice began, with an unsettling undertone resonating in its depths. John listened intently as the man on the recording started describing the unexplainable sounds he heard outside.
"Every night I hear footsteps. Someone is wandering around,"
the watchman continued in a trembling voice.
"But whenever I go outside, no one is there."
John brought the tape recorder closer to his ear, and for a moment the crackling and static drowned out the watchman's voice. Then it came through again, this time more urgently.
"Last night I heard a woman's laughter. Not like an echo, but close, in the woods."
John felt a sudden chill that seeped deep into his bones. His breathing quickened as he realized he was subconsciously watching every shadow in the room. The voice continued.
"When I stepped outside, the laughter stopped, but I feel like someone is watching me. The forest is alive, even though it shouldn't be."
Then the recording ended in a silence more terrifying than the voice itself. John decided to stay overnight at the camp. He wanted to experience firsthand the atmosphere the watchman had described. As dusk fell, he set up his tent beside one of the dilapidated cabins. He lit a small fire, casting shadows on the old wooden structures, and every crackle reminded him of the sounds the watchman had spoken about. With the first stars, the forest plunged into silence, a terrifying, heavy, and impenetrable quiet. The air grew still, laden with a tension John could feel on his skin. Then, suddenly, he heard footsteps, soft but unmistakable. His heart began to race, but he forced himself to stay put and scan the surroundings. Nothing, just mist and the distant rustle of branches. For a while, he sat in the silence, feeling as if the entire forest were waiting for his next move. Then the footsteps stopped, and a heavy silence returned. Uneasily, John turned back to the fire, but the watchman's voice echoed in his mind. As he glanced around the darkened forest, he noticed a strange movement among the trees. A silhouette, faint but clear. He stood up, his eyes fixed on the figure, which seemed to be formed from the mist itself. The figure drew closer, silent as a ghost. "What do you want?" John whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive stillness. No answer came, only a chill that enveloped him, as if death itself were coiling around him. The silhouette paused momentarily, then turned and vanished back into the mist. The next morning, John woke up shaken and uneasy. The feeling that someone, or something, had been watching him lingered. He decided to return to the cabin where he'd found the tape recorder and play another recording. This time, the watchman's voice was shakier than before, and every word echoed with a terrifying realization.
Something is playing a game with me.
The watchman began in a quiet, halting voice.
At night, I hear knocking on the doors, on the windows, all around me. I open up, but no one is there.
John felt his breath quicken. Every word sounded like a warning, yet it pulled him deeper into the heart of the forest, where the trees whispered the secrets of those who had vanished long ago.
It's here.
The watchman's voice continued, this time filled with panic.
I can't leave. I tried yesterday, but the forest won't let me. It's as if the forest itself has come alive.
In the background of the recording, a rustling sound could be heard, and then the recording ended in crackling and a silence that was almost more terrifying than the voice itself. John felt he had to find out more. The forest drew him in, even though every instinct in his body screamed for him to run. He pushed through the underbrush, and with each step deeper, he was filled with both dread and excitement. The air was thick, charged with an invisible pressure that surrounded him, and the mist around him began to take on strange, eerie shapes. Then he heard laughter, soft, yet terrifyingly close. He turned, but there was no one in sight. When he listened again, the laughter had vanished, leaving only the trees whispering in the breeze. Then something caught his eye. On an old, moss-covered bench in the middle of the forest lay another tape recorder. John approached it, and without knowing why, he picked it up and turned it on. The tape recorder clicked on with a brief crackle, and once again, the deep, weary voice of the watchman emerged. This time, however, his tone was different, filled with terror, despair, and a strange, resigned surrender. John listened as if in a trance, his fingers trembling with each word from the recording.
Seventh day.
The watchman's voice began, and John held his breath.
I can't sleep. Every night I hear voices. Something is calling me. Something I can't recognize. It sounds like the moaning of the wind through the trees. But I know it's not the wind.
The voice broke off, as if the watchman were listening to something around him, and John found himself also listening to the silence of the forest surrounding him. Then the watchman continued, his voice even shakier than before.
Today, I saw it in the shadows between the trees. Something was moving. It was tall, unnaturally crooked, and it was watching me.
The voice suddenly lowered to a broken whisper that froze John in place.
I could swear it was smiling.
At these words, John felt his blood turn cold. The thought that something in the forest not only saw him but sought out his gaze filled him with a dark terror. He set down the tape recorder and looked around, as if he might catch a glimpse of that creature lurking in the shadows between the trees. As evening descended, a fresh wave of fear washed over him. John knew he should leave, yet something held him there. He decided to spend another night at the camp, hoping that perhaps he would understand more. that the atmosphere of this place might reveal another piece of the puzzle. But as the sun set and the night mist crept between the trees, he realized that this decision might have been his biggest mistake. Sitting in his tent, his only companion was a flashlight. Though its light barely penetrated the darkness outside, the forest around him fell silent, and the twilight transformed into a thick, impenetrable blackness. He felt every gust of air, every rustle, as if they were signals meant to warn him. And then, he heard it. Footsteps, quiet but unmistakable, as if someone or something was slowly circling his tent. Each step was slow, carefully measured, as though the one making them knew that John was listening to every sound. His heart pounded, every muscle in his body tense, and he forced himself to look through the small gap in the zipper. He saw nothing, only darkness and shadows. Then he heard a whisper, quiet, hissing as if it were coming from every direction.
Come.
Whispered a voice that sounded like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but John knew it wasn't the wind. He pressed his back against the wall of the tent, his eyes narrowed in fear.
Come.
Then the footsteps stopped. A silence so deep fell that John could hear his own breathing. He felt that something was standing outside, directly behind his tent, breathing and waiting. Something on the other side of the fabric. John endured the night in a state that was more sleepless vigilance than rest. As dawn broke, he checked the tape recorder he'd brought back from the forest the previous day. He knew he was exposing himself to new horrors, but a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable inner drive to complete his work compelled him to press play once more.
Last night,
The watchman's voice began, this time weak and broken.
I see it constantly, even when I close my eyes. I see that smile. Something is moving in the forest. Every night, it gets closer and closer.
John felt his breath quicken. He knew exactly what the watchman meant. He had experienced it himself, that something watching him was getting closer, as if it were preparing to strike.
Tonight, it wasn't just a smile. I saw its hands reaching out toward me.
The voice trembled with terror, and John realized that his own hands were shaking as well. He suddenly felt a chill in the room, one not caused by the morning breeze, but by something far more sinister.
If anyone hears this, never return to that forest.
The voice continued.
The forest hides something. Something that doesn't know how to stop. That doesn't leave. Please, never come back.
And then there was silence. The recording ended, and John sat motionless, his body paralyzed by what he had just heard. John knew he should leave. Every fiber of his being begged him to run, but instead, he ventured back into the forest. He wanted to find what he had seen that night, wanted to prove it was just his own fear, his mind. Slowly, he pushed through the undergrowth, each step intensifying the dread that seeped into his bones. Then he stopped. A shadow moved among the trees, a dark, twisted figure, just as the watchman had described. He froze, unable to turn, as if something held him in place. The figure approached, its body bending at unnatural angles, its head tilted at a grotesque angle, with empty, dark eyes watching him. Then he heard it. That smile, a sinister, dark grin carrying something far worse than any sound. A blast of icy air struck his face. In that instant, overcome by terror, John turned and began to run, crashing through branches and bushes, feeling that something was still behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached the forest's edge, his breath shaking, his heart pounding like a drum. When he finally looked back, he saw only the forest, as though the horrifying creature had vanished with the dawn. But John knew that the memory of that gaze would haunt him for the rest of his life.